Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you very much for the invitation for what I hadn't realized was your first of 2022. So
it wasn't supposed to be.
That's the way it goes, for sure. So where this talk really came from, if you like, is, so I spend a lot of time working with organizations, and I think in the last few years, many organizations have jumped onto the Agile transformation bandwagon and gone through that particular conversation, if you like, internally. But then you start getting the question about how do we measure our transformation? When are we done? It's almost like they just want it to be over without really buying into that whole idea that it's never probably ever going to be over. But and of course, that conversation leads to a lot of different things. And I'm just sharing here a handful of the I would say odd conversations I've had about how to measure the success of a transformation. We're Agile because we've been Agile for many years, and it's sort of to the first person that ever read the Agile Manifesto or took some sort of a Scrum course or whatever it might be, or there's a percentage of their projects that are Agile, the number of teams that they have as an Agile team, and so on, all of which are quite peculiar because they're not measures that anybody who's in the Agile space would ever use to say you've achieved agility. And yet, of course, they're very easy to strive for, and they give, I mean, we understand with big organizations, they need to kind of dumb down the message a little bit to be able to get buy-in and so on. So I get where they're coming from. And this ended up leading to a number of conversations about maturity of Agile. And the first thing I wanted to touch on is I've done a lot of work on maturity models, and we all understand them. This is a Wikipedia definition of maturity, and it feels like the right sort of thing. We're talking about the ability of an organization for continuous improvement in a particular discipline and so on. And you go from a low maturity environment to a high maturity environment, and we all feel like that's sort of the right thing that's going along. And what you often see when you look at materials is it's almost an awakening piece where you go from no recognized discipline, and I'm literally, this is actually quoting the CMMI level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So the lowest level is we don't even know we need a discipline here. Moving through, there's some sort of defined discipline. Maybe there's an office that is responsible for that discipline, to the rarefied atmosphere of an organization that's continually improving. And what's interesting is if you look at maturity models from how we get a product out of the door, DevOps, for example, right? This all makes sense. I can move from the left to the right in the sense of I start off with a very manual release process. I eventually bring some tooling in, I get some sort of standardization, so I now have that definition of a system that's really a process flow, if you like, that's well defined, and then eventually you get to something that's really continuously improving. But this is where things get a bit weird, because when we're looking at organizational change, this isn't very useful as a maturity model. I'm not saying if we focus on releasing products, we should not become more mature in releasing products. That's not what I mean. But I mean that in order to deliver a business, we have to build maturity at lots of different levels. So if I think about releasing a product, I have to also build maturity in being able to build a product. And if I'm building a product, I probably need some level of maturity in designing a product. And that definition of maturity that I started with is a right to left thing, when as an organization and a business that's focused on serving the customer, we care about the top to bottom thing. And so as we understand this, what we kind of realized, and I have these very odd conversations where people want to measure maturity rather than effectively speed to market and all the benefits that come with them. So what we're really looking for is maturity across a number of different dimensions, and then looking at that not necessarily now from a maturity perspective, but from an outcome and a speed to market. This is where cycle time comes in, and all of the measures that we all love and spend our time talking to our clients with. Now, can I just say, it looks like things aren't moving. Are you still staring at the increasing maturity in a given discipline screen?
It says increasing performance in value delivery, and you got
excellent. That's perfect. We're going in the right direction. If when I'm talking the screen stops changing, please let me know, because I'm experimenting with my iPad as the second screen, and my iPad has not realized it's the second screen just yet.
Just keep reminding it. You're the second.
So we'll get there. It's not a big deal. And I should say as well, as we're going through, if you want to throw in some questions or observations, use the chat function, for example, or just jump in and say something as we're going. So what's interesting is if I just go back that one slide here, what I've just described here is a Wardley map. And so when I'm looking at Wardley mapping and beginning to understand a little bit about how the two connect together, it's really putting axes on this graph of 3 different maturity disciplines maturing from left to right, coupled with organizational competence or time to market on the top to bottom. So let me walk through what a Wardley map looks like and give you just that high level, simple way of creating it. The graph that you see here, or the space that you see here, the y-axis is value chain. And in Wardley Maps, we talk about a value chain in the same way that you can think of value streams, in the sense that at the top of the value chain, closest to the customer, this is what we talk about as being visible. It's visible to the customer. The customer knows you're delivering value for a given product or service. And as you go down that y-axis closer and closer to the bottom of the page, that becomes less and less visible to the end user or the customer. On the x-axis, we talk about evolution, and evolution goes from left. We don't really know what we're doing, so we've got to build it all from scratch every single time. It's what we refer to as that Genesis piece to the right, where it's commoditized. And I'll give you a bit more detail as we go in here. So if I look at just the value chain to start with, visible to the customer. Now, what I find incredibly valuable about creating a Wardley map is it's what you bring the level of detail you choose to bring to it. So we can go all the way down to infrastructure, or you can go beyond that and say, and I need power, or I need data coming from a certain place, or power, or chips, whatever is necessary, machines that create the infrastructure and so on. You can really kind of deconstruct your product in as much detail or lack of as you choose to. And as we're looking on that value stream, the customer at the top, this is the things that the customer is going to recognize and buy. They're going to buy your product or service over others because you do a better job of whatever it is you're doing. But that product or service is built on other things that your customer may not interact with. They might know you have, for example, you must have some sort of product management, but they won't necessarily interact with that product management. It's a little bit invisible to them. And that product management with agile delivery teams and agile delivery teams delivering product on some sort of infrastructure, quite frankly, half of your customers won't even realize that you might have a data center or infrastructure. They just don't think about how they get the products or services that they use. It's completely invisible. And yet, if you don't have those aspects of your value chain, you can't deliver the service. And as we all know, every time we see a failure on AWS, an outage on AWS, or any of these other, these invisible aspects of our value chain, when they disappear, all of the value often disappears. So there's definitely, we need to be aware of them, but we don't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about them, especially when we're near the customer. And at the top, I've put that sort of surprise and delight customers. The part of the reason I put that there is so many organizations go, okay, this is what we serve to the customer. We're an insurance company and we serve great insurance. And that isn't sufficient. That's not the value that you're offering. The value has to be, why would you use one insurer over another? Is it ease because I get it as a package when I get a bank account or a credit card or whatever it might be? Is it because you have a reputation for paying claims out? because it's a family thing. I've been in the town for as many years as I can remember. You've always been on the corner. We've got to understand that value in terms of more than just the features that we're delivering, for sure. Now, as I move that to the evolution axis, this is the genesis to custom to product to commodity. That's we get more and more mature as we move from left to right. So let me explain a bit about what we mean by that sort of genesis, custom, product, and commodity. And it's really, I think we relate to this very well when we think of software or hardware, because it's product delivery. We understand that, right? So Genesis is innovative. If anybody's, you're writing the code and you're producing it yourself, and you just, every time it needs to change, you've got to go in and build it, and there's nobody else can support it. That's the innovative Genesis piece. As you move to custom, that's when things become more and more sort of, you're kind of not quite pulling things off the shelf, but it's customized now. Now you can go to the market and you can find people that customize things, or you make it custom from your own perspective. You use it, but you now start white labeling it or whatever that might be. But it's still very much the bespoke model there. But then as time creeps on, you very quickly end up in the product rental space. This is where we can literally go out and buy something from the market. And we can use this, you can very definitely see how this would work for infrastructure. With my background, I remember years ago working with the web agencies, and nearly every single client built its own content management system. And in fact, we spent a lot of time effectively doing custom content management systems for companies because they wanted to get on the web. They needed some way of editing content once they got there. So we're creating content management systems left, right, and center. The first one, Genesis, we're building it ourselves. After that, we're kind of repurposing it and reselling it to lots of different clients, customizing it as we go. Nowadays, nobody in their right mind would create a content management system. You're going to go buy it off the shelf. And in fact, it's getting to the point now where it's in fact commoditized. So instead of buying it or renting it, it's just part of any system that you get. Nowadays, content management is just buried into nearly any major application system that's front end, that's looking at the front end. So as you move to the right, you get to the point where it becomes a utility or a commodity. And when you're in that utility commodity space, you should be buying it, number one. And in fact, you're negotiating the price down as far as you can. And you just standardize everything that's around it. And so if we look from the left to the right, one of the first things that we end up doing with the Wardley map, the first thing that we did was, what are the aspects in the value chain? So at a high level for Agile transformation or sort of agility, business agility, we've got the business agility, that's the fluffy non-technical stuff that we can't really define, but it has to do with funding, and then marketing is in there, and some sort of stakeholders or executive team defining our objectives and where we're going. That filters down into a product ownership. And that's probably the last piece that most customers are aware of. They might bump into product managers in some way through marketing events or whatever that might be. Then you go down to Agile delivery, which is going to build whatever the product owners define. And then you've got infrastructure, which is going to host whatever the product delivery teams define. So now from an evolution perspective, we want to think, if I take infrastructure, are we in the Genesis stage on infrastructure, a custom, product, or commodity? And we're going to move it left to right based on where we think our current evolution is within an organization. Agile delivery, the same. So if I just, you may want to think a bit about it, about where it might be, but I'm just going to kind of pick a few places, right? And a couple of things to watch for. Number one is, the closer you get to your customer, it's much more likely that you're in the Genesis custom space. Why? Because that's how you add your magic sauce. You're not going to be in the commodity space at that customer space, because then how on earth do you persuade your customers to use you? You're basically, they expect to plug something in the wall and have have electricity. You're no different to kind of power, water, and various other things that we rely on but don't think too much about. So that top, whatever's visible to our customers, is likely to be Genesis or custom. And as you go down that value chain, you should be moving to the right. Why? Because if you're Genesis and custom all the way down, it means that you're not taking any cost benefits. You're not going to the market to say, I need a content management system. I don't want to build one. That doesn't make sense. Why don't I just pull something off the market? What product can I go find in the market? So as you go down this, you see that you should generally be shifting over to the right-hand side as we go. And then the final thing that we end up doing is we join all the dots as we're looking at it. So that's basically how we create a Wardley map. And it comes from that whole conversation, as I said before, about maturity, when all of a sudden we're leading into this and trying to understand what we're looking at in terms of where we are in the marketplace. And then there's a couple of things that we need to watch for here, which is the first thing is, just because we place ourselves, for example, in Agile delivery at maybe somewhere in the custom space, doesn't mean the market is there. So this is where, because we might just be either way ahead of the market, potentially, in which case most of the market is behind us and to the left, or we're kind of fast or slow followers of the market, in which case most of the market has punted off to the right, and we're just the laggards, the slow adopters in terms of that particular discipline. So this is what brings us to how we can use Wardley Maps. And I find this bit, this is one of those things where a glass of beer and a piece of paper and a long conversation, there's some really interesting things we can dig out about that. So the first thing to understand, and I really like what Simon Wardley's done around picking apart the strategy piece. And if you've seen any of the videos from Simon Wardley, he has an opinion. He has a view about strategy consultants in particular, but he has a view about how strategy has in many cases missed the point. And I have to say, having worked with a lot of organizations on their strategy, I kind of begin understanding, yeah, this makes sense. I've seen, so he uses the strategy cycle that is defined by Sun Tzu's The Art of War. And there's 5 different steps here. And the first one is purpose, landscape, climate, doctrine, and leadership. And many strategy conversations focus on the purpose, what Wardley describes as the game. That's what game are we in and what are we trying to do? And in a lot of cases, and I've certainly been in these workshops where you get to the point where you go, great, we know what our purpose is. We know what, we've got a rock solid why, we know what we're trying to do. And again, Simon Sinek's made a fortune telling us about why we should do things and the importance of why. But how do we then turn that into something that we can do? And this is part of that challenge, is that leap from now we know what we're doing to what do we actually do to do what we're doing, if that makes sense. How do we make that a success? Becomes where Wardley Maps becomes quite interesting. So we start looking at things like, well, what's the landscape that we're working in? And if you think back to what we've just created in terms of the simple Wardley map for some sort of agile organization, well, now we can begin seeing that. We can start looking at this and go, well, hold on, we know that landscape. Maybe we can work with that landscape and see what comes from it. So if I look at that landscape, that's what my Wardley map starts providing. It gives us the landscape. And again, now I just want to remind us that when we're looking at this, I've taken this very kind of simple high view of agile transformations and business agility. But if I'm in a different type of product space, I might need to tie together things like partners and other pieces that come with that. There are lots of other elements in that value chain that might be critical to the product or service that we're bringing to the market. So do bear in mind that whole definition of that, the value chain in particular, is somewhere to spend the right amount of time and kind of get a deep understanding of. But now what we want to do is start looking at that landscape and then the climate side. So again, I'm getting very differing hints of what's going on from my second screen here. So if I do lose things, you're just going to flag me down. So the first thing is we understand what we're trying to do, the purpose. Secondly, we've mapped our landscape. And the third thing is the climate. That's and again, in the art of war, this is, you know, the landscape of the mountains or the rivers that you've got to ford, the mountains that you've got to cross, where you're at in terms of achieving your long-term strategy. Well, the climate is, what's the weather like? Literally, what's happening that's influencing where we stand that we can't do too much about. It's just going to happen. So in this particular case, here's some of the aspects of the climate. The first thing is there's a natural tendency for all of these disciplines in our value chain to move to the right, right? It's just natural that software delivery starts as a genesis activity, and as it matures both in a company and in a market, it's going to move to be a custom type of activity, and then it's going to move to be a product rental type activity, and eventually it will become commoditized. So what you see is there's a continuous drift to the right-hand side. And what's powerful now is that we can really look at this and start talking to organizations and saying, I know you don't think agile delivery is a big deal, and you think that you've got lots of reasons. If anybody's read that wonderful paper, and I am being a little bit sarcastic there, but the paper about bimodal agile that came out a few years ago. And that was talking about that you'll need agile delivery when you're doing software delivery, but if you're doing anything on infrastructure, vendor products, you're not going to need agile. And this idea of bimodal, you've got two places or two ways of doing things. Well, as you start looking at things like this, you understand that there's a continuous pressure to move to the right, whether it's agile delivery, whether it's on vendor products, moving to the right, infrastructure, and so on. All of these things are moving to the right. So that's that element of climate. We can't stop it. Now, what can stop it are our own organizational impediments. Within our organization, and this again, the bimodal paper is one of the things that kind of feeds into that. But when you go into an organization and a department refuses to jump on and align their delivery expectations or their support staff, work to the cycles that you're delivering in an agile context, you're going to hold the company back in following through with that drift from left to right. So that climate perspective is this whole idea of understanding both where the market's going and then also understanding or viewing the sort of responses your organization might be making in terms of preventing it either getting ahead of that or staying in touch with that market as it moves over to the right. So that's, again, if I just think of the Wardley map itself, now it's gone from we're understanding discipline maturity, and we tied it right to the beginning to say we've got to look at the entire value chain, because discipline maturity, having the most disciplined infrastructure, right-hand side, push a button, everything goes live is great. But if we don't have product ownership, agile delivery aligned with that, and even if we don't have business agility, our customers aren't going to see the benefits that they could be seeing. So Wardley Map is helping us, the Wardley Maps are helping us sort of understand the playing field, if you like. And they're also telling us a little bit about what's happening in that playing field, and we can interpret that in terms of our own organizations. But now it also has another whole dimension to it, which is what are the opportunities that we can look for? So in this particular case, it's like, how can we look for areas to work in? Shama, go ahead.
Hey,
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So my question is about, we talked about business agility and you have surprise customer, delight customer. Are you saying the rightward shift at that level is to surprise customer first and delight customer? Is that the continuum that you're talking about?
I think in those cases, I would look at it in a slightly different way, which is you want to continually surprise your customer. So you've got to continually look for new ways of surprising your customer, because the product that you served your customer up and surprised your customer and delighted your customer with 4 or 5 years ago, well, now they've got complacent. They've got 27 apps that do that on their phone. They get it for free when when they buy a new device or whatever it is. It becomes something that I mean, it is a continuous race. It's a bit like an arms race that you have to continually try for. Now, I do think if you go into a certain field and dominate it, you can be ahead of the curve on that and stay ahead of it and define that market. And there's many Silicon Valley companies, just to call out, that would do, that's their goal, right? That's why they have the valuations and the money behind them. From your own businesses, we want to get that balance of delighting and surprising customers and understanding it. And I think it's less that you're going to let it go and then you got to jump on the next one, let it go and jump on the next one. If your surprise and delight moves to the right, your business is going to become really difficult to yield a profit, right? It gets very difficult as you're moving to the right. I mean, not in the custom Genesis. It doesn't have to get difficult like tomorrow, but it's going to become a problem. And again, there's a whole bunch of strategy around cash cows and all the rest of it that starts coming into that innovator's dilemma as well.
Thank you.
Okay. No worries. So what I really like in the opportunities, this is quite a weird thing to look at. So the first one I wanted to look at is the obvious opportunity is mature your disciplines. What we started from, get more mature at it. And we've seen that accelerate in the world of DevOps. Agile delivery is following behind. It's a little bit more complicated because you can't just replace people with tools or enable people with tools in the same way that you're able to in many cases in the infrastructure space, but it's still moving inexorably, without any kind of slowing down, if you like, over to the right-hand side. And so there's opportunity in moving to the right. And there's opportunity there. This is in removing organizational barriers to accelerate to the right and catch up with the rest of the market, or simply getting ahead of the market by shifting things to the right. Now, the other space that opens up is up and to the left. And this is where really interesting stuff can happen, right? So, and what's happening here is as you mature your value chain, things that were expensive become cheap, and things that you could only get one of, you can suddenly get 1,000 of. And so you can build products and services leveraging the fact that you've got all of those things, like all of those things are becoming more and more commoditized. And there's a lovely little, if anybody's seen this or read this book, it's a lovely little story of basically an art student who as a project decided they'd go and make a toaster. So it's a UK-based art student, and he decided he was going to make a toaster, and he's written a book about it, and it's hilarious. Because of course, toasters are one of those things that would never, nobody would make one from scratch if you had to make the chip and all of the materials and everything. The toaster is something that only exists because of all of the other innovations and shifts of left to right have happened. So the picture that you can see here is his final project delivery at the end of it, the toaster project, that's his toaster. And he turned it on and it didn't even make a piece of toast. It basically blew up within seconds, right? And what he did is he tried to make the oil, refine the oil to make the plastic. He tried to go find the copper, mine the copper to make the copper wire, and all of these bits and pieces to kind of go through how you would make a toaster. And at the end of the book, I think he spent something like £14,000 over a year to make a toaster that you can buy for $40 or $20 in any hardware store, right? In any whatever it is, Canadian Tire or the equivalent. But this is an example of the innovation that we can get by looking up and to the left, because as all of these different elements that we need to stitch together to make a toaster are commoditized, somebody somewhere is suddenly going to go, hey, hold on, we can stitch these together in a creative and innovative way and come up with a product or service that we never had before and that we can now suddenly kind of go to market with. And when we look at some of these things, it becomes very interesting because you can start recognizing where that's happening. So if I just go back here for a second, if I look at things like Silicon Valley and where they're going in terms of disruptive markets now, what's interesting is they're taking literally the capabilities that they have around infrastructure, agile delivery, product ownership with a big digital in front of it. And they're looking at those opportunities up at the top left to say, hold on, how can we take these digital skills that we have and take them to the market and disrupt a mechanical, non-digital space that doesn't fully appreciate how the world has changed from a digital context. And so that's one of the reasons why they're able to go into some really diverse industry sectors and disrupt them, is because of this opening up in the left-hand side. And so knowing some of those things, in the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes, I just want to go into what does it mean from an agile, because my space is agile transformations. And as anybody knows, back in the day, I used to work with a different organization. Now I've started my own entity up. And what's interesting is if you go out and try and do what you did 5 years ago or what you did 10 years ago, there isn't the market there. It's shifting off to the right-hand side. So what can we look at in terms of landscape and climate to understand just that little bit of where is the market going? Because I think in many cases, we're all kind of looking for where that market might go, or we're involved in a shifting marketplace that it's good to understand where it goes. So here's a few observations. If I'm looking at that, the Wardley map in terms of agile transformations. Before I dive into that, I just heard some feedback, or it may have been a question coming in. So is there any questions? No? Cool.
So Dave, there's an assumption that agile delivery is becoming, a core competency of most organizations. Is it just the Silicon Valley thing, or do you see a lot of organizations like financial services, banks that have been there for very long actually making that transformation, making that transition, or is it that they're going to be replaced by new organizations? So those fintechs and what have you.
So when I think of things like fintechs, to try and look at that space that you're looking at, the fintechs are looking where the green clouds are up at the top left, right? And as a bank, their job is not to look up there. They're going to buy them as they move from Genesis into custom into product. And that cycle, I don't think is being disrupted in such a way, as in, if you work in fintechs, it's not like the banks are suddenly going to look at a Wardley map and go, you know what, we should go and do all of these things. They're not set up for it organizationally. The fintechs are the ones who are looking at this to say, what can we build on? What experience do we have that no one else has? Or and I think where this becomes really interesting is, what are the commoditized skills that you have experience of that you can stitch together to create something that, let's say it's in the fintech space, that can really go after that. And I think this is in some ways, it really opens up that whole idea of entrepreneurship is not going anywhere. It's in fact accelerating, because as we're moving more and more technologies out to the right. Now, I want to pick up, Shyam, what you just were talking about agile delivery, because I think we've got to remember this is quite stretched out, right? So here's the sort of where things are going, if you like, or what we're seeing, what I'm seeing, and what we're seeing as a whole is things like the infrastructure and the platform as a service is accelerating into the product to commodity side. We should be buying the tools that we're using. We should be buying the platforms, renting in some cases, leasing, in that sort of And again, Amazon Web Services really set the standard for that and has accelerated to the right. But there are many, many examples of platforms as a service or application as a service. Agile delivery in the context of rapid application development and getting things out of the door with dedicated teams is quite an interesting one, because if there's anybody here who's worked in big organizations, well, there is no way they're buying Agile teams off the shelf right now. They're all in the custom space. So we're right in the middle of lots of organizations realizing they can't have those kind of innovative groups that are doing the Agile delivery off in wherever it was they were before, when it was the Genesis stage. And they now need to bring their own agility to the table. And if anybody's familiar with this, the first thing they do is they say, but we need to bring our flavor of Agile. That's classic custom language, right? They don't have to. It's just they're not ready to move to the out of a box, how do I go get an Agile team? Now, what's interesting for those of us in that space, there are companies already hiring or leasing out Agile delivery teams. Right now, and I know there are companies that are coming in and saying, we will create your Agile delivery teams. I'm not actually meaning that. I'm meaning ones that you can lease a team sprint by sprint. Right? And they have teams that are dedicated teams, they perform together. And I mean, the reality is they're probably a little expensive at the moment. Yeah, exactly, the hieropod model. They're probably a little expensive right now, but they would, depending on your technical problem, they're probably going to outperform many of your own teams. Exactly. Mark's offering to sell them to you if you need one, right? So that Agile delivery is a really interesting piece, because there's a couple of things. I work in the space of helping set teams up, and we've basically thrown that. We've gone, okay, there's no point. Why? Because everybody's setting teams up, and you can go and kind of cookie cutter teams. And I know there's many experts on the call who would disagree with the cookie cuttering, but the reality is you can get 80% of the way there by cookie cuttering teams, and it's happening all the time. I don't think we're seeing these big organizations really hire lease teams all the time. That's not happening yet, but it will do. It's going to continue moving in that direction. Product ownership is really an interesting space, because any of us who are working in this, and I bump into, we have a number of products really dedicated towards the product ownership piece. And what we're finding is, as an example, is product owners are rare, good product owners, exceedingly rare. And when you do get a product owner, they're unique. They're in that Genesis stage. So every product owner brings its own flavor and so on. But we've sort of got a standard around product ownership and product management, but now it's being disrupted as product management thinking is interacting with product ownership thinking. So there's a lot of churn in that product ownership space. I'd still leave it pretty firmly in the Genesis area. It is beginning to move into custom. It's going to become more routine, and there's going to be days, you know, that this sort of we're going to be able to go get product owners who can slot in many areas quite well. But that product ownership has kind of two big things. One is that shift to the right. That's bound to happen. But then the other one is what's going to come up behind the scenes on that one. As we've talked about, when we look at things like the Agile delivery, there's a number of things that we're already seeing in the market, tools around that. But in the product ownership space, I'd say the tool space, the services that support product owners is pretty like ripe for opportunity would be the way I would look at it. And that's partly because product ownership is still emerging in terms of understanding where it's going and how, you know, what the path is to move from left to right. And then you hit business agility, and that's even further to the left. I mean, most organizations are very, very far away from a really understanding business agility. And it's even the language isn't well understood. Like, we can talk about the language around product ownership, but when we talk about business agility, one of the conversations we have with a lot of executives is, well, we need to, you know, make an agile organization. And then, as Peter and I talk about on our podcast quite a lot, what does that mean? Well, nobody really knows. And and there isn't any sort of model that's emerging around funding models and marketing and alignment of product marketing with product delivery and all of the things that go with that. There's hints of it, but there's not really a well-established kind of definition in there. Again, an opportunity perhaps, but certainly that's on that business agility side. I think there's a lot more to do still to move that from the left to the right. And that's really just the piece that I wanted to cover, is just get to this point of understanding A, how to create a Wardley map, and B, how to read it and start using it to be strategic about the services that you offer, the products that you're supporting, or when things should sunset, all of the conversations which are so we need to have more of those conversations, but we rarely actually have the tools with which we can visualize and understand what those conversations are. So that's sort of my closing. Any questions, any comments or observations, other interpretations would be very welcome as well.
Yeah, no, I am observing something like, rent a team within an organization in which we redeploy a team from one product area to another product area, but it doesn't come without its pains. And people cognitively understand that, hey, listen, we should be, if we are agile, we should be ready and willing to work on one product area today and on a completely different product area a month from now, because that's what the market demands. But I'm seeing that happen and on an experimental basis, but it has a lot of pain associated with it. So
yeah, it's interesting. One of the organizations we work with is we've had the pleasure of working with is the provincial government here in BC, in British Columbia, and there they have the idea or the concept of $1 million team. Right, and the numbers work with the numbers. I'm just using it as it's a sort of a marketing spin, yeah. But basically going through the ministries saying, if you've got a problem, we'll put $1 million team together. $1 million roughly is the cost of a team for a year, and that's a line item that they can put into their budgets and so on, and they'll stand the team up and go through that. Exactly to your point, that painful? Yeah, of course it is, because we're still in a process, especially in financial, big organizations or governments, where there's still a lot of, we're a long way to the left typically. What's interesting, there's a company called Menlo Innovations just out of Ann Arbor. Yeah, and they're go visit them if you can. I guess they'll be back in person at some point if they're not already. They always used to run tours through their dev shop, and it's basically a dev shop, less than 100 people, but their teams, they have done for many years development sprint by sprint, right? And it's so there's definitely ways of making that work, but like you say, Sham, it's painful. It's going to be for a while, and we don't want to, as you were describing that, I was thinking, this isn't trying to be a fungible team that you can just plug and play. You need to get the right teams for the right problems, right? So that you want to avoid that there as well.
Yeah, and what I have observed is that in the underlying infrastructure is consistent in a large organization. The team work on similar technologies, therefore it's technically it's fungible. What makes a difference is the quality of product ownership, as to whether the product ownership is able to direct the delivery team appropriately, knowing that the technology skill set is similar, whether they worked previously or before, in how it is, that is what is the difference maker from my observation, from a limited observation.
For sure. Marcus, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Dave. Look, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. Absolutely fantastic. Question around how do you go, can you give us some examples? How do you go about collecting the information to produce the Wardley map? Do you do that centrally? Do you use data? Just maybe some pragmatic insights around how to go about producing them.
So typically you're going to do this with sort of senior directors and so on who have some idea of what's going on. What's interesting, go look at the org chart, things like that, to find out, because what you often find is, if you think of these horizontal rows, you'll often find a VP or a director in charge of those, right? So you can see from that side where things are coming in, as in you can start building that out. And I think it's like, if anybody's a consultant, we always love this sort of vague, ambiguous area, because we can go, well, it depends, and we can say, we need one for this context, we need one for this context, and so on. There are a number of great examples which are out there that have been created by a lot of people in this space. What I really like to do is I do think the company knows. You're not going to uncover necessarily something they don't know about, because typically the company is very well aware of it. But that can change with time. So as I'm describing this, one of the things that I noticed is the supply chain hiccups that we've seen in the last few years. Well, what's interesting is Amazon, I read an article where Amazon has started basically buying its own ships, and they bought smaller ships that they can move around, so that when the larger ports are blocked up, they can still move those smaller ships into other regional ports. So that speaks to an understanding of, again, when we get something from Amazon, we don't start thinking about the fact that it's on a ship for 3 months coming in from wherever it's coming in from, and all of those things. Those are invisible elements of the value chain. But that's also, and we all know Amazon do this exceptionally well, of course, but Amazon is very aware of its value chain. So where do you get it from? Start off by the departments that you've got. Get some executives, because they're worried about these things. They're worried about, I mean, I remember years ago when I used to run a data center, for example, you're worrying all about infrastructure, and then you're worrying about where the power comes from and all the rest of it, and so on. So you can see some of these dependencies start creeping in, because they're in your disaster recovery plans. They're in your the risks that key executives are worrying about in their departments. So that would be a place to start, I think.
Thank you.
Hey,
Cool.
will you be sharing the slides by any chance? Is there a way that
I will send them through for sure. Yeah, I'll ping them over to Peter so he can get them out to everyone. Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool.
Any other questions, or should we wrap up for the evening?
Couple of things. I mean, I can go on. I mean, like, so I thought
only for about 8
we were scheduled for 4 hours or something, right? I mean, so it's I take it upon me to use the rest of the 3 hours. So anyway, but that notwithstanding, a couple of things. What would you advise if one wanted to learn about Wardley mapping for our purposes? What might be? I mean, don't ask me to go to Simon Wardley's Medium, the book on Medium. But is there any other way that we could learn this stuff easily?
And I'm sure it's going to start happening more and more this year. But Simon Wardley's always swinging through North America. You should definitely probably come and speak something like this if you can reach out to him and get hold of him. The Medium book is the one I've kind of used the most in the Wardley Maps. That list, there's a great, there's a long list. There's a great community actually in the Wardley Map space. That's where I'd start with the Medium book. I mean, there is a book on Medium written by Simon Wardley. It's not published, at least I'm not aware of it being published just yet, but he's basically written the book and it's on Medium. That's a great place to start. And it's not a terribly long read. So it's something that you can kind of skim through relatively easily. The resources that Jeff's sharing there is a great place, and that's that Wardley Maps community. And then the other thing is, I know there are practitioners across North America. Just get hold of them and connect with them and start asking them what they're up to, where they go with that.
And any thoughts, suggestions on what would be a leading edge literature on business agility as of now? I know that
Oh, that, I know that one. That's SSH, right?
Yeah. BDSSH. Yeah. I mean, that notwithstanding, yeah, that's definitely a good one, no doubt.
So I don't know that there's a load of books coming out that people are claiming to that, and I'm not, first of all, I'm not well read on every single one of them. But I think the problem I have with business agility is people don't know how to define it. So when people are looking at business agility, one of the first books I suggest people look at is actually Leadership Agility. It has nothing to do with business agility, but it has to do with the fact that if your leaders don't change, then your business is definitely not going to change. And understanding and appreciating, and Leadership Agility, Bill Joyner's book, it was written with the Agile in the title before Agile was cool, if you like. So he gets a bit of an honorable mention from that perspective. But his leadership development model is a great place to start and start looking at people, business organizations for that. There's Jeff's pointing that I was just going to say BAI, the Business Agility Institute, has a whole bunch of things, and I know they just ran something in New York. They ran an event, or they will be running an event in a couple of weeks' time.
Next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff. So the Business Agility Institute and Evan, who runs that, and the work that they're trying to do, I really like what they're trying to do, in the sense of they're understanding business agility, not from a book written by an Agile practitioner that's trying to claim it, but more from what are the businesses needing and what does agility look like in different fields and different sectors. And so the way they're approaching that is really quite nice. The other thing is that Business Agility Institute does have a publishing arm that they're beginning to kind of leverage. So keep an eye on what goes through that, because that's kind of an interesting place to start hunting around, I would say, for things.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything you'd add, Jeff?
Thanks, Jeff.
You covered it off really nicely. Good presentation tonight, Dave. Thanks for this.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Thanks for everyone for hanging on as well, and I appreciate that. And the questions and the feedback has been great.
Thanks a lot for doing it.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And thanks for hosting, Peter.